Would you notice if your tour guide never blinked? Or if their voice sounded like a distorted recording of a person? We are diving into 5 true field trip horror stories in which the person leading the way was something else entirely. From the wilderness to abandoned ruins, these students followed a non-human entity into the shadows, discovering that some authorities should never be followed into the dark. Before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you never miss a step on these trails. Now settle in and let's walk the line between the living and the thing pretending to be one. Madison Calloway, a sharp-eyed 16-year-old from Palatka, Florida, still wakes up with the taste of swamp water in the back of her throat, even though she knows she never swallowed any. And the reason she can't shake it is because of what happened on the AP Biology field trip to Dead Horse Swamp. A sunken cypress preserve where the water is black as cold coffee and the Spanish moss hangs so thick it brushes your face like clammy fingers. And on that morning in late April, their regular teacher, Mrs. Dever, had called in sick with a stomach bug, so the substitute was a man. None of them had ever seen before, a tall, gaunt figure in a crisp forest green ranger uniform who introduced himself as Ranger. Keith, with a smile that showed too many teeth, but somehow never reached his eyes. Eyes that were the color of a cat's at dusk. A strange amber that caught the light in a way that felt less like reflection and more like a light source of its own. And right from the start, Madison felt a low-grade hum of wrongness because Ranger Keith's voice didn't quite sync with his lips, like a poorly dubbed nature documentary. And when he told the class to form a single-file line and follow him down the boardwalk into the deepest part of the swamp, nobody questioned it because he was the authority figure, and he wore the badge, and he spoke with that calm, instructional cadence that made you trust him, even though the hair on Madison's arms was standing straight up. And as they walked, the boardwalk transitioned from pressure-treated wood to something older, something spongy and dark that seemed to absorb the sound of their footsteps. And the swamp around them went unnervingly quiet. No frogs, no birds, just the slow drip of water from the knees of the cypress trees and the steady, a rhythmic gait of Ranger Keith, whose legs moved in a way that Madison's brain kept trying to describe as backward, but couldn't quite pin down. Until her best friend Diego leaned over and whispered, his knees bent the other way, and Madison looked down at the Ranger's legs and felt her stomach drop into a cold abyss, because Diego was right. The joints were articulating in the wrong direction. And when she looked back up, Ranger Keith had stopped at the edge of a clearing. A perfectly circular patch of muddy water ringed by ancient trees, and he turned to face the class with that smile still plastered on, but now his mouth was hanging open a little too wide, the corners stretching toward his ears, and he said, "This is the best spot for specimens. The water holds memories of every living thing that has ever dissolved here. Please step into the pool, and you'll understand the ecosystem from the inside out." And his voice had dropped an octave. Now a resonant rumble that vibrated in Madison's chest like a second heartbeat. And 3 kids at the front of the line, mesmerized or maybe hypnotized, started wading into the black water with blank expressions. The murk climbing past their knees, their waists, and Madison screamed. A raw, tearing sound that shattered the trance, and suddenly Ranger Keith's head swiveled toward her on a neck that turned a full 100. In 80 degrees while his body remained facing the water, his face now a mask of predatory fury, the amber eyes burning, and she grabbed Diego's hand and ran. Ran down that spongy boardwalk that seemed to stretch and curve and loop back on itself like a living intestine, the air filling with a low, guttural clicking sound that she realized was coming from Ranger Keith's throat. a sound that seemed to drill into her skull. And after what felt like hours of blind sprinting, they burst out of the tree line into the parking lot where the yellow school bus sat like a sanctuary. And when she looked back, the swamp was perfectly still, the boardwalk empty, the ranger gone. But floating in the center of that circular pool were 3 backpacks she recognized as belonging to the kids who had walked into the water. And the police dragged the swamp for weeks but never found any bodies. Just the 3 backpacks filled with mud and a 4th item that made no sense. A ranger badge with the name Keith engraved on it. Except when they ran the serial number, it belonged to a man who had died in 1974 while leading a field trip into that very swamp, a man whose body was never recovered. And Madison now cannot look at any person in a uniform without checking to see if their knees bend the right way, because she knows that some guides are just lures wearing the skin of what we trust. Tyler Nguyen, a 17-year-old geology nerd from Butte, Montana, still dreams of the sound of a pickaxe striking rock deep beneath the earth. A sound that came not from a recording or a museum exhibit, but from a living, breathing figure that claimed to be a miner from 1917. The whole thing started on a crisp October morning when his high school's earth science class took a field trip to the abandoned Anaconda copper mine, a sprawling subterranean labyrinth that had been closed for decades after a catastrophic cave-in entombed 47 men. And the Historical Society had recently opened a small section for educational tours, led by a docent named Mr. Grady, who was supposed to meet them at the entrance. Except when the bus pulled up, the only person standing at the mine gate was a man in a dust-caked canvas jumpsuit, an old-fashioned carbide lamp hooked to his helmet, his face smeared with soot, and his hands wrapped in frayed leather gloves, and he introduced himself in a voice that sounded like gravel rolling downhill. "Name's Ezekiel Harper. I'll be your guide down into the drift. Stay close, and don't touch the walls or the walls might touch you." Back, and the substitute teacher, Mr. Halverson, just shrugged and said, "I guess the society sent a reenactor. Pretty immersive." And Tyler felt a thrill of excitement because he loved history, and this guy looked like he had stepped right out of a sepia photograph. And as the group descended the sloping shaft, the temperature dropped sharply, and the electric light strung along the ceiling flickered and buzzed, the shadows dancing like frantic ghosts. And Ezekiel's carbide lamp cast a warm, buttery glow that somehow seemed to push the darkness back more aggressively than it should, as if the darkness was a physical thing resisting the light. And the miner began talking about the mountain's veins, how the copper was the earth's blood, and mining, it was a sacred act that required sacrifice. And Tyler noticed that the man's boots left no footprints in the thick dust on the tunnel floor. And when he pointed this out to his friend Lexi, she just rolled her eyes and said, "It's probably a trick of the lighting. Don't be weird." But Tyler's internal alarm was already ringing, because Ezekiel kept using the present tense when referring to his fellow miners, saying things like old Jimmy O'Toole runs the trammer over in Shaft 9. He's always whistling that mournful tune. And when Tyler asked if he meant the historical Jimmy O'Toole, Ezekiel turned and fixed him with eyes that were entirely black. No whites, no iris, just 2 pits that seemed to pull at Tyler's vision. And the miner said, "Historical. Well, son Jimmy was alive and cursing this morning." The whole mountain shuddering, and dust rained from the ceiling, and several students screamed. But Ezekiel just laughed, a dry, hollow sound, and said, "That's just the shift change. Nothing to fear." And then he turned down a side passage that Tyler was certain hadn't been there a moment before. A narrow, jagged tunnel that was not reinforced with modern supports, but held up by ancient, splintered timbers that looked ready to snap. And the group followed because Ezekiel was the guide, because Mr. Halverson was busy trying to get a signal on his phone, because the alternative was standing alone in the dark. And the passage sloped steeply downward, the air growing hot and thick with the smell of sulfur and something else, something sweet and rotten like meat left in a warm locker. And they emerged into a vast cavern that was definitely not on any modern map. A chamber lit by dozens of flickering carbide lamps mounted on the helmets of figures who were working the rock face. Dozens of men in jumpsuits identical to Ezekiel's, their movements synchronized in an eerie mechanical rhythm. Pickaxes rising and falling, but the men didn't make any sound, no grunts of effort, no clanking of tools. Just the relentless thud of steel against stone. And Tyler realized with a jolt of ice-cold horror that the miners were not entirely solid. He could see the rock face through their bodies if he squinted, and their faces. When they occasionally turned toward, the group were blank, eroded, like statues worn smooth by centuries of wind, and Ezekiel strode into the center of the chamber and raised his arms, his voice booming. Welcome to Shaft 9, the shift that never ends. The mountain always needs more hands. I think we've found some volunteers, and the spectral miners stopped their work and turned as one, their eyeless faces orienting toward the terrified students. And that's when Tyler noticed the back wall of the cavern was not rock, but a smooth obsidian black surface that seemed to breathe, a membrane of darkness that bulged outward in rhythmic pulses. And Ezekiel walked toward it, and the membrane parted like a curtain, revealing a void so absolute it made the mind's darkness look like noon. A void that whispered in a language of cracking bones and grinding teeth. And Tyler grabbed Lexi and Mr. Halverson and screamed, "Run, run now!" And they fled back up the twisting tunnel, the sound of 100 pickaxes striking in unison growing louder behind them. A marching cadence of stone and death, and they burst out of the mine entrance into blinding daylight, coughing and retching, and behind them, the mine was dark and silent. The entrance looking exactly as it had before, except for one detail, a single carbide lamp sitting on the ground, still burning with a buttery flame, a lamp that had the name E. Harper engraved on the fuel reservoir. And the Historical Society later confirmed that Ezekiel Harper was one of the 47 men entombed in the 1917 cave-in. His body never recovered, and Tyler still wears a small piece of copper in his pocket as a ward. Because sometimes at night he hears the rhythmic thud of a pickaxe coming from the depths of his own basement, a sound that grows a little closer with each passing week, and he knows that the mountain never forgets a promise of fresh hands. Elena Vasquez, a 20-year-old anthropology major from Flagstaff, Arizona, learned the hard way that some guides are not employed by any tour company when she joined a university field expedition into the remote CG Canyon system to study ancestral Puebloan cliff dwellings. A trip that was supposed to be led by Professor Whitman, but when the group of 12 students arrived at the trailhead before dawn, the professor was nowhere to be found, and instead, a tall, slender Navajo man in a worn denim jacket and a turquoise bolo tie was standing beside the trail register. His hair a glossy black curtain that seemed to drink the early morning light. And he introduced himself as Hastian, just a friend of the canyon. "I'll be walking you in since Dr. Whitman is running late. He'll meet us at the first ruin." And his voice was warm and melodious, full of gentle humor. But Elena noticed right away that the man's shadow fell in the wrong direction, stretching east toward the rising sun instead of west. And when she tried to point this out to her classmate Brian, he just laughed and said, "You're an anthro major. You're overthinking symbolism. It's just a shadow." And she wanted to believe him because everything else about Hastian seemed so reassuring. His knowledge of the canyon's history was encyclopedic. He pointed out petroglyphs that weren't in any guidebook. He warned them away from loose scree and hidden drop-offs with a casual confidence that suggested he had walked these trails for centuries. And as they descended deeper into the winding sandstone labyrinth, the temperature rose and the walls narrowed until they were walking single file through a slot canyon so tight their shoulders brushed both sides. And Elena's unease escalated to raw fear when she looked down at Hastian's feet and saw that his moccasin-clad footprints were oriented backward, the heel pointing in the direction of their travel, the toe prints facing toward the group as if he was walking toward them while moving away. And she whispered urgently to Brian, "Look at his tracks. He's walking the wrong way." And Brian looked, and his face went ashen, and he stammered, "Maybe it's a trick, some kind of cultural thing." But then Hastian stopped at a fork in the canyon where a massive, gnarled juniper tree grew out of a crack in the rock, its roots snaking down the wall like petrified veins. And the guide turned, and his head rotated just a fraction of a second slower than his body, as if the two were not firmly attached. And his smile widened, revealing teeth that were subtly too uniform, too white, like dentures carved from bleached bone. And he said, "This tree marks the boundary between the outer world and the inner world. Beyond this point, you are guests of the canyon, and the canyon requires an offering, something of yourself, a memory, a fear, or a future you choose." And his voice had lost all its warmth. Now a dry rustle like wind through dead cornstalks, and the air around him shimmered, the way pavement shimmers on a hot day, distorting his outline so that for a split second Elena saw not a man, but a towering, angular shape covered in what looked like bristly fur or feathers, a creature with legs that bent backward at the knee and arms that ended in 3 long, curving claws. And then the shimmer stopped, and Hastian was a man again, still smiling, waiting. And Elena's survival instinct kicked in like a shot of adrenaline. She grabbed Brian's arm and yelled, "He's a skinwalker, don't give him anything." She bolted back up the slot canyon, dragging Brian. And behind them, they heard a sound that was half laughter and half the shriek of a hawk. And the canyon walls seemed to contract and expand as they ran, the sandstone pulsing like the inside of a throat. And the light changed, the sun skipping across the sky and fast forward, shadows whipping around them. And they kept running until they collapsed at the trailhead, where Professor Whitman was just pulling up in a jeep, apologizing profusely for a flat tire. And Elena tried to explain what happened, but her words came out in jumbled fragments. And when the rangers searched the canyon, they found no sign of Hastian. But they did find the other 10 students standing silently in a circle around the twisted juniper tree, their eyes open but empty, their mouths moving in unison, repeating a phrase in a language that no linguist at the university could identify. And those 10 students were physically fine, but they never spoke another word of English. They just sat in their rooms and stared at walls. Sometimes at night, Elena feels a tugging at the edges of her mind, pulled to return to the canyon, to walk backward through the slot and present her offering at the juniper tree. And she keeps a small pouch of ash tied around her neck because a Navajo elder told her it might buy her time. But she knows the canyon is patient, and one day it will collect what it is owed. Jamal Roberts, a 14-year-old from Oakland, California, never believed in the stories about Camp Whispering Pines until the summer his parents sent him there to build character, and he found himself on a forced nature hike that was led by a counselor who wasn't on the staff roster. A counselor named Caleb, who appeared at the edge of the archery range on the third day of camp with a clipboard and a grin that was a little too wide, announcing that the afternoon's activity was a compass orienteering course through the deep woods. And Jamal's cabin group was assigned to Caleb's squad, and off they went. 8 boys trudging into the pine forest with the sun filtering through the canopy in dappled coins of gold. And at first, Caleb seemed like the perfect camp counselor, telling funny stories about bears and teaching them how to identify deer scat and keeping up a relentless stream of upbeat chatter. But Jamal started to notice little inconsistencies, like how Caleb never called any kid by name, even though he was supposedly their assigned counselor. How he referred to the compass directions as away and farther instead of north or south. And how the trees around them started to look identical, the same scarred bark, the same moss pattern, as if they were walking past the same 6 trees, over and over again. And when Jamal pointed this out, Caleb laughed and said, "The woods like to play tricks. It's just your city eyes adjusting." But then the sun stopped moving, the dappled light freezing in place, the shadows becoming fixed. And the forest fell completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind. And Jamal could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears like a war drum. And Caleb stopped at the edge of a small clearing where the ground was covered not in pine needles, but in a thick carpet of white ash. As if a fire had burned here years ago and nothing had ever grown back. And in the center of the clearing stood a single wooden chair, old and splintered, facing them like a throne waiting for a king. And Caleb turned, and his face was different. The skin slack and gray, the eyes gone filmy white like the eyes of a dead fish, and his smile had somehow migrated upward. The corners of his mouth now at his temples, the grin stretching into the hairline. And his voice came out in a wet, gurgling whisper. "Congratulations, squad. You've found the final checkpoint. The chair of becoming. One of you will sit, and the rest of you will feed the woods. It's a fair trade. The trees are so hungry, and they've been waiting for fresh sap for a very long time." And the pine trees around the clearing began to sway even though there was no wind, their trunks groaning as they bent inward, their branches elongating into thin, twitching fingers that reached toward the boys. And Jamal's cabin mates were frozen in terror. But Jamal remembered the emergency whistle hanging around his neck, and he blew it with every ounce of air in his lungs. A shrill, piercing shriek that shattered the unnatural silence. In the moment the whistle sounded, Caleb let out a sound that was not a scream, but a massive, oscillating drone, like 1,000 hornets trapped in a metal drum. And the chair in the clearing collapsed into a pile of splinters, and the trees snapped back to their upright positions, and the sun jumped across the sky by several hours. And suddenly the forest was full of normal noise again, bird song, rustling leaves, the distant rush of the camp's river. And Jamal and the other boys ran blindly until they stumbled into the main camp, where the director's face went pale when they described Caleb, because no counselor named Caleb had ever worked at Camp Whispering Pines. But there was a record of a boy named Caleb Atwood who had attended the camp in 1987. A boy who had wandered off during a compass orienteering exercise and was never found. His disappearance, the very incident that had led the camp to install the emergency whistle system. And Jamal sleeps with that whistle under his pillow every night, even now, years later. Because sometimes when the wind blows through the pine trees outside his Oakland window, he hears not the rustle of needles but a gurgling whisper that asks if he's ready to take a seat in the clearing. Chelsea Dunham, a 19-year-old photography student from Providence, Rhode Island, chose the abandoned Blackstone Sanatorium for her final project because she wanted to capture the beauty of decay. The way peeling paint and broken windows could tell stories of the forgotten. And the Historical Society offered a guided after-hours tour for artists. It's a chance to explore the crumbling halls with a docent who knew the building's secrets. And that's how she met Miss Partridge, a middle-aged woman in a severe gray dress and a cameo brooch. Her hair twisted into an old-fashioned chignon, her smile demure and professional. And from the moment the heavy iron doors clanged shut behind the group of 6 artists, Chelsea felt a dense, oppressive cold that was not just temperature, but a pressure, a weight on the chest. And Miss Partridge's tour was mesmerizingly detailed. She described the hydrotherapy tubs where patients were submerged for hours, insulin shock wards, the electroconvulsive therapy rooms with their leather restraints still buckled, and her voice was a smooth, hypnotic river that made the horrors sound almost clinical. But Chelsea's artist's eye kept snagging on details that didn't add up. Miss Partridge's reflection did not appear in the countless dusty mirrors that lined the corridors. Her cameo brooch was pinned on the right side of her dress, a style that went out of fashion in the 1930s. And when she walked past a window, the light passed straight through her dress, as if she were made of smoke. And Chelsea started taking pictures not of the architecture but of the docent. And on her digital screen the images showed no woman at all, just a column of static. A vaguely human-shaped distortion that burned the pixels with a cold white noise. And when Chelsea looked up from her camera, Miss Partridge was standing directly in front of her, inches away, and her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes, they were not eyes at all, but 2 dark tunnels that bored straight into Chelsea's skull. And Miss Partridge said in a voice that was suddenly a chorus, a layered harmony of dozens of voices speaking as one. You've noticed, haven't you, dear? The truth beneath the skin of this place is the asylum never closed. You see, it just perfected its methods. The patients became the walls, the floors, the ceilings. Every scream absorbed into the plaster. Every tear soaked into the floorboards. And I am the head nurse, the eternal curator of the collection. The board of directors has asked me to find new permanent residents for the East Wing. Artists are preferred. They have such sensitive souls that season the walls beautifully. And Chelsea dropped her camera and backed away, her breath pluming in the icy air, and she saw that the other 5 artists were standing perfectly still, their faces slack, drool running down their chins. And the walls of the corridor were no longer peeling plaster, but a slick organic surface, a glistening membrane that pulsed with a deep red light. And the floor was softening underfoot, becoming something like a tongue, and Chelsea screamed and ran down corridors that stretched and twisted. Up staircases that spiraled into impossible geometries, past rooms where shadows of former patients reenacted their last moments in endless loops. And she only escaped because she crashed straight through a boarded-up window, falling 2 stories into a hedge. And when she looked back, the asylum was dark and still, and Miss Partridge was standing in the broken window, her shape backlit by a red glow that shouldn't have been there, and she waved a slow, deliberate gesture. And her voice floated down on the night air. Keep your studio ready, Chelsea. There's a lovely padded room with your name already on the door, and Chelsea's camera was later found in the rubble, its memory card corrupted except for one file, A clear photograph of a door in the East Wing with a brass nameplate that read Chelsea Dunham. It's admitted in perpetuity, and she has moved 3 times since then. But every apartment she rents has a door that, when she wakes at 3 a.m., seems to have a brass nameplate that wasn't there when she fell asleep. Those 5 field trips all share one chilling thread. The guide at the front of the line was never human to begin with. If you ever find yourself on a school trip, a nature hike, or a historical tour, and something feels just slightly off about the person leading you, a shadow in the wrong place, a gait that breaks rhythm, a face that doesn't quite sync with its voice, do not follow. Trust your gut and walk back the way you came, even if it means walking alone. Now I want to hear from you. Which of these stories would have sent you sprinting for the exit? Drop a comment below. And if you want more true horror from the borders of reality, hit that like button and subscribe with notifications on. Remember, the next permission slip you sign might not lead to a museum. It might lead straight into a collection that never closes. Stay safe, and never follow a guide with no pulse.